You're listening to episode 311 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practices from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Ron Serrano joins us to speak about meditating with others and the group Dharmachanics. Hi, everyone. Before we begin today's episode, I'd like to mention that this podcast and the supporting website, discussion forums, our live online practice circle, and other services provided by the Secular Buddhist Association are supported by you. If you find this episode or any other offerings helpful to you in some way, I ask that you take a moment and visit secularbuddhism.org and click on the contributions button. There are many ways you can help, which are listed on that page, and if you make a donation, it's tax deductible and helps ensure the SBA is able to continue the exploration of secular Buddhism. Thank you. We're glad to have you join us in the conversation. Sitting with others is an interesting experience, from stories about other participants to working with annoyance at sounds. Even just the perception of the presence of others can have an impact. Often this is an opportunity to practice working with not having things go exactly our way, or as you might have called it, dukkha. It's also a chance to be encouraged and inspired. And for those listening to this episode, you may also be interested in listening to my talk with Lama Tsomo about this very topic on my other podcast last week, Present Moment Mindfulness Practice and Science, which is linked on the episode page for this episode of The Secular Buddhist. Ron Serrano has practiced yoga and Buddhist meditation for over 20 years. He has been a frequent subject in neuroscience studies of long-term meditators. He is also a founding member of Dharmachanics, a virtual, online, experimental sangha. So, sit back, relax, and have a nice community. Our guest today is Ron Serrano. Ron, welcome to the podcast. Glad to have you here.
Ted, pleasure to be here.
So you and I have gotten to know each other a little bit through something we'll talk about a bit later on in the podcast. But before we get on to a couple of the topics we want to cover, why don't you let us get to know you a little bit and tell us about yourself?
Well, I'm going to start at the very beginning, if that's all right. I grew up in a Catholic family, and we went to church every Sunday. And I never really sort of got it. Christianity didn't sort of, I really didn't get it. And it's interesting now, many years later, after practicing Buddhism for quite a few years, Christianity actually makes a lot more sense to me now, but it didn't make any sense at the time. And so when I went away to college, there was really no connection to any kind of religion or practice of any kind. Then one day, sort of out of the blue, there was what I'll call a spontaneous consciousness experience. And it's what the Tibetans would refer to as recognition of mind essence. Zen folks would call it a Kensho experience. Theravada would call it a path moment. And it really was just under the most mundane circumstances. I was in a university washroom, and I was just walked up to a sink to wash my hands, looked down into the sink, and then boom, it happened. Very, very short. Sometimes it's described as awareness, knowing itself as itself. All those kind of classic descriptions are, they're helpful and sort of point in a direction, but they don't really sort of don't really do it justice. And it was very, very ordinary, but it was also very stunning. It was a moment of being awake, and as a result, everything that had come before was seen as having a kind of a quality of being like confused in a dream state. And it actually could have had a much bigger impact on my life had it been understood, but I had no context for it. Sometimes you hear about these examples of these false positive experiences people have where they study the tradition for many years. They hear about these kinds of experiences, these various varieties of experiences that are kind of well known. They want to have the experience, and then something happens, and they think they had that experience. That couldn't have happened here because I had zero context. I'd never heard about anything like this. And in fact, if someone had described something like it, I wouldn't have understood it. It wouldn't have made any sense to me whatsoever. So this was just sort of one of these sort of spontaneous things. Interestingly, I did, as an aside, I realize now at the time, a very intense concentration practice as a result of collegiate athletics. And I didn't think of it as such, but that's actually what it was. Mm-hmm. And as you know, those kinds of experiences, there's an element of luck. The saying about they're lucky, but practice tends to make you more luck prone. And so there's no way of knowing for sure, what leads to one thing or doesn't. But I suspect that was the reason why it happened, or that it precipitated. Okay, so now fast forward 20 years. And I basically, that experience, I never forgot it. But the conclusion I came to, because I didn't have any context, was that it was just an anomaly, that it wasn't really, although it was real, it had this quality of being real, that it was nice but not useful. And I spent a couple of weeks walking around, looking down into sinks, trying to precipitate it again, nothing. So I just went back to sort of, living my life as I had been. Now, so 20 years later, I had been involved in business and a variety of ventures, and I was attending a week-long leadership training program. It's out in Washington, and it was given by two guys, one of whom was an ex-Kripalu CFO. He was a yogi, and Kripalu, the yoga retreat up in Massachusetts. And it was quite an innovative, quite an interesting program. It was a leadership course. And it started out it was a week long. Every morning, it started out with a yoga session that this guy, Mark Buell, led. And he was from the Kripalu lineage. His guru, Amrit Desai, had been a disciple of Swami Kripalu. So it was kind of a serious Kundalini yoga guy. So he gave this yoga session, half an hour yoga session every morning for people that were new to it. And I had never done yoga before. So the first morning, he gives the instructions and you start to do the yoga. And I did just about everything wrong, because I wanted to do things kind of my way. I had a sort of better way to do it. And so, but in spite of having done everything wrong, at the end of the half hour, I found myself in the state where there was all of this, there's a lot of energy, but it was very, very controlled, calm energy. And the mental state was very, very clear. And it was actually very reminiscent of that momentary experience 20 years earlier. I didn't really fully make that connection, but I knew this was something really, really different. And during the course of that training program, I got to know Mark better. He described to me a number of experiences that he had called Kundalini yoga experiences. And a couple of years after that, I found myself in life circumstances where I had a lot of personal freedom. And I decided that it would be extremely interesting to really pursue this Kundalini yoga thing, see what it was all about. So I took Mark as a teacher and some of the other teachers at the Kripalu. And it was really very interesting stuff. A lot of energy got moving through the body, lots of constrictions that I didn't even know I had started to open up. And with that, a whole host of meditative experiences happened because those constraints, those constrictions really stop a lot of natural body processes and neurotransmitter flows. And I started having these meditative experiences, and I found out that the Vedanta folks, they did not have to see, they're very, very skilled. They knew a lot of very powerful stuff, but their understanding of meditative experiences seemed to be incomplete. So then I started going to some Buddhist retreats, and I started talking to people and asking questions. And all roads seemed to point to Lee Brazington, a mutual friend of ours. And I know he's been on your show before. And they basically said, oh, yeah, meditative experiences, Lee's your guy. That's the guy you got to talk to. So I contacted Lee. He and I met in early, maybe I think 2001 it was. And I spent about an hour with him up at Barre, Massachusetts, where he was doing a retreat. And he gave me the pith instructions for the jhanas in that 1 hour. And I've basically done the jhanas just about every day since then. I later came back, did a couple retreats with Lee. Then I really started to have some meditative experiences because there was now a structure, sort of a path to the kind of meandering that I've been doing meditation. And I also started having a lot of lucid dream experiences. I had a few lucid dreams before that, but now with the meditation, it was happening on a very regular basis. And I started journaling lucid dreams. I started to learn dream yoga and started to use the nighttime as a kind of a consciousness laboratory to do consciousness experiments. Well, after I did those 2 retreats with Lee, I realized that I was not going to be able to do retreats anymore. I had a couple of young children, and leaving was just not going to be possible. So what I did is I declared myself on permanent retreat. And I just said that what I'm going to do is I'm just forevermore, I'm on retreat. And I had been told there was a rule of thumb that if you know that level of consciousness you get into a retreat, everything sort of calms down, the mind gets very clear, and then it lasts for a little while, and then you go home, it's over. And even when you try to meditate, it's gone. Well, the rule of thumb, this was actually from Ida Kima, was that 2 hours, that if you get to that level on a retreat and then meditate a minimum of 2 hours every day, you can maintain something akin to that level of consciousness on retreat. And so I did that. I pretty much every single day since then, I've done that. And I would say the rule of thumb, in my experience, is it's a pretty good rule of thumb. And the other thing that I tried to do was make it a 24/7 practice, so that even when I wasn't meditating, I was trying to be mindful. As sometimes that works better than others, but the intention was always there. And that even during the day, that I would try to view activities as a form of service. So, even something like, going to the grocery store to pick up a quart of milk or something. I would view it with the intention of doing it as a benefit to someone else, someone in the family. And then I mentioned the dream yoga practice. So really the notion was a 24/7. And then about, I would say maybe 5 or 6 years later, maybe probably somewhere between 5 and 10, I don't know precisely, I got a call from Judson Brewer, who is another mutual friend of ours. And Judson was starting to do some studies on long-term meditators. And he asked me to be a subject in that. And so we started doing the fMRI stuff in New Haven at Yale, where he was, not that far from Yale. And it was, I wound up being a subject in a series of studies of his, continuing, to through now. Judd and I talk, fairly regular basis. But the other nice thing about it is that he was bringing in these meditators, from all over North America, really even from all over the world. So now, after having been kind of a monk, by myself in my basement for 5 to 10 years, suddenly I was meeting kind of a who's who in Buddhism, and it was very exhilarating. It's a serious learning process took place. Then a couple of years later, I got a call from Vince Horn, who was getting ready to. It was another interview of yours, and he was getting ready to do a Buddhist Geeks community, an online virtual sangha, and he asked me to be part of the beta group, the original beta group for that. So I participated in that, and the Buddhist Geeks community was really it was a great thing. It was very exhilarating. A lot of great people were brought together, a lot of great exchange of ideas. It only lasted a fairly short time, though. And when it terminated, there were a group of us that said, gee, this is an experiment that should not stop. Let's see if there's some way to allow this thing to sort of, rise phoenix-like from its ashes. And about a dozen of us got together and said, let's just continue the experiment. And that sort of brings us to Dharmachanics, where I mentioned at the beginning, and kind of to the present time.
Thank you for that overview. And so it's interesting. That's a good segue of what we mean by, and the listeners know this, one of the three gems in Buddhism is Sangha, community. And as I mentioned in the introduction for this episode, there are a couple different ways in which that's read. For some, it's very strictly only monastics. We're taking a broader view here. And I'm wondering if you might share on, for purposes of our conversation or topic today on community, what do you mean by it and why is that important?
Yeah, I would describe Sangha in the broadest sense as a Dharma support group. Okay? So Dharma and Sangha are two of those gems that you mentioned. They really work together. And the power of the Sangha is the power of the Dharma. Basically, the Dharma works. Okay? Dharma is a technology for training your mind so that it is more calm and more clear. That may sound very simple, but calm, clear mind is very, very powerful. You become much more of a sense of well-being. You're happier. You become a better human being, world, generous, passionate. And so it really works. It is, however, very different. Puts you in sort of a segment of the population that's very different from the rest of the world, because the rest of the world is really going in an opposite direction. And most of the things that people pursue are either things that they want more of or things that they want to get away from. And those tend to make the mind less clear and less calm. So if you're on this other path, one thing about a calm, clear mind is that it tends to deconstruct the ego. The ego really cannot stand the light of day because the ego is it's basically delusion. It's something I made up, and it seems like it's functional. In the short term, it allows me to function in the world, but it actually turns out to be less functional. It creates a lot of anxiety, a lot of modern day problems that we know about. So if you are on this path, the Dharma path, it's think of it as a process of getting more sane in a world where many people are involved in a process that is taking a direction. It actually can be quite unsettling to deconstruct ego. It is for most people. One exception is jhana meditators, because the jhanas are, which I know you're familiar with, because the jhanas actually are a deconstruction mechanism. It's kind of gentle and it's very blissful. it's not quite so unsettling. But for the vast majority of people, deconstructing the ego is an unsettling process. So the beauty of Sangha is that you're with a group of like-minded people that are on sort of a similar path. And it creates nothing creates a sense of confidence more than success. So that's true in your own practice, right? When you try something, you try a meditation technique and it works, you develop a sense of confidence. And it's amplified when you're in a community, when you're in a Sangha. It's like an echo chamber where the successes are if you've got a relationship with people and you share your insights, it's like you're turbocharging things. You're turbocharging those successes, and it tends to fuel it. And that's why the Dharma and Sangha are so closely related, and why they tend to co-evolve, not just historically, but particularly today in this virtual environment.
Yeah, so one of the things I actually want to unpack a little bit, so I'm glad you brought this up, is this idea of support for one's practice with people who are on a similar path that may not be exactly the same, but people are here to do contemplative practice. And one of the possibilities with that is, as you mentioned, that comes along with that support is that idea of the echo chamber. And there's also a caution that can come with that as well, that we see communities can sometimes get on a mob mentality or a bandwagon of having a particular experience as the reason we're doing this. And so I'm wondering if you had a few thoughts about ways in which one might use the practice itself, seeing clearly, as a way to help distinguish and understand when someone else's experience might not be yours. The story you're hearing might not be an accurate one. It is just a story. And especially things around, the reason I bring this up, we see abuses by some teachers and even some monastics in our tradition. This is not other traditions. This is in ours as well. And how important it is to also maintain that too. So I'm wondering if you could share some thoughts about that.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot there, Ted. The first thing I would say is it's important to keep in mind that this is never about the experiences, right? There's no experience, no matter how, phantasmagorical or whatever. They're just fleeting. They're just impermanent, like everything else. It's so the real yardsticks that you're going to use are much more practical things in terms of the quality of your life, a stable state of well-being and equanimity, and what I mentioned earlier, your effectiveness in the world, your functionality in the world, the ability to help other people be more stable and clear, generosity, compassion, those kinds of things are much more significant, much more meaningful. The experiences can be helpful. It's helpful to, as I mentioned earlier, to understand them and know what they mean, ones that are relevant or irrelevant, and then drop them, and then get back to the basic practice that drives it down the path. And the thing you mentioned about the abuses, it's kind of, the thing about all humans having sort of the three virtues and then three obscurations, right? So there's those potential downsides, and it's actually one of the real benefits of a virtual community. There's a whole level of interaction that can take place that supports practice and supports Dharma and supports one's progression without having to worry about a lot of the kinds of abuses. We have members that have known each other for 5, 6, 7 years. The vast majority of our members have never met another member physical space. There are some disadvantages of that, but there's also some real benefits, and there's a whole set of things you don't have to worry about.
Yeah, and it's interesting to hear you say that, and that's a good segue to our next topic, Dharmachanics. But I just wanted to mention that what you describe about virtual communities holds true for our own practice circle that Mark Nickelbein of the Secular Buddhist Association manages and hosts has been going now for years. And it is, in my experience as a teacher in person and online, the closeness you develop is every bit as strong as you do with face-to-face in meet space kinds of situations, and also has some degree of avoiding some of the problems that in-person communities may run into, and are not something that we should spiritually bypass, because it just allows it to continue. And that's a different podcast for another time. But for now, let's segue into Dharmachanics. What is that? How did it start?
Yeah. Let's start with Buddhist Geeks, because that was sort of the forerunner. As I mentioned, Buddhist Geeks really only lasted a short time. I mean, really only a little bit over a year. And in a sense, it was very exhilarating, and it was, in a sense, ahead of its time. And there's always that always makes things a bit difficult. So, what I'm about to say is not it's not a criticism. It's just sort of reality of what happens when you are ahead of your time. Things happen that you could not have anticipated. So one of the issues was the business model. There were costs associated with the way it was set up. And of course, in order to be a going concern, you have to cover costs. And also, some people are looking at it as a source of livelihood. So that creates more of an economic burden. And what it meant was that there was a very short window where the business model had to prove in. And I do think there was some you had Vince on your podcast. There were some very innovative things going on there. And a lot of it was staged as experiments. They were just going to try things and see what works. And I suspect they would have sorted a lot of it out had they had more time, but the window closed too fast. So there was no choice. So when that dozen or so folks that I mentioned got together and said, "Hey, let's do something new. Let's continue the experiment. Let's call it Dharmachanics." We thought it was a nice blend of sort of the old and the new. The fact that it was Dharma, that there was a rigor to it, a system to it, mechanics to it. And so we started to try to figure out, well, what is this thing? And really, in a sense, Buddhist Geeks never really had enough time to really figure out what they were about. What were they really trying to do? So, if you and I were going to start a monastery, it is a bunch of things that would be a given. We would know what the objectives and goals of the monastery would be. We would know what some of the options are for achieving those objectives. And so we could sort of plan it out. Well, things never got that concrete. So we decided it turned out that 12 people really couldn't agree on much. The only thing we could really agree on is that we liked each other and that this thing should continue. So we did decide a few things. So one is we decided that it was going to be a null business model. There was going to be zero cost, and that there was not going to be a penny that was going to change hands. So if in fact we fail, it was not going to be for an economics reason. This thing was going to be free. You as a member, you'd never be asked for a penny. The second thing that we decided is that we were going to be an experimental group. So there was a lot of things that some people thought things should be a certain way, others thought it should be a different way. We just didn't know. And so we said, rather than argue about it, let's create an experiment. Let's find out. Let's let the world give us some feedback. And we've always been that way. And, people who are familiar with us know that we're always doing it. There's always an experiment. And the beauty of experiments is that you can't lose, because if the experiment works, then you've got a success and you do more of it. If it turns out if the experiment fails, well, then it's even better, because you learn something major, and that helps you define the next experiment. And then the third thing that we did is we intentionally did not decide, primarily because we could not decide, what it really was. What was the support we were going to be providing? Okay? So you can think of support as a continuum. On the light end, it's just kind of a social group, like most communities on the internet. It's a bunch of folks with a similar interest And they get together, they chat, they maybe, exchange some articles or some information. And it's kind of loose and it's friendly, but that's about it. The other end would be a no fooling virtual monastery. So, in the old days, if you really wanted to get liberated, you would sort of give up everything, you go to the monastery, how that works, and you get whatever support you needed. You get Dharma, you get structure, the whole ball of wax. And we intentionally didn't decide on that because we couldn't. Obviously, we were going to do the social end because we were already a bunch of friends, and we were going to, these communities of bulletin boards. You post retreats, you post articles of interest. So we were certainly going to do that. And we were going to try to experiment and see just how far we could go to the other end of that spectrum. Right? Now, that's really tricky, because a lot of my background is in business. And in business, that's the kiss of death, because that's trying to be everything to everybody. And that never works. If you try to do that, you wind up being nothing to anybody because you kind of have to do everything. Well, something very surprising has happened. And it turns out that you can actually do a lot on that continuum. And you can go pretty far because we have a number of people who are kind of in that sort of monastic, a monk in the world mode, where they're trying to practice, just about all the time, every day. And there is a lot that a group of like-minded people can do along that continuum. So it's something that we're continuing to experiment with.
So tell us about a few of the offerings that you have there, because I know quite a number that you are doing right now, at least as of this recording, that people who are listening to the podcast might be interested in.
Yeah, let's just sort of check down the list here. One of the basic things, most fundamental things, are peer-to-peer groups. Okay, so unlike a monastery, there's no hierarchy here. There's no teacher. There's no head monastery head. And the beauty of not having teacher is that de facto what happens is you have all teachers. So that means a couple of things. One is we can use all the teachings, and we use, there's all kinds of Dharma available for free on the internet. You can get literally any teacher, and it's getting more and more broad. It's even getting some of the much more esoteric traditions, a lot more of the Tibetan teachers now, some of the very esoteric teaching you can get online. And the other thing is that every member in the Sangha becomes a teacher. Both we're all students and we're all teachers. And, not surprisingly, some of our members have a lot of years in practice, multiple decades in Zen, Theravada, Vajrayana. So in general, they can probably be imparting more wisdom than folks who haven't been around as long. But it really cuts, all the way around. Every new member, everyone's meditators, so everyone has some background, something they practice, maybe a particular practice that they know. So we get to leverage off one another. So that's where the peer-to-peer comes in. It's a group of people that you know well, you respect, you have confidence in, and you really share your practice. And so it happens every week. We've got 3 of these. There's a morning one, there's an afternoon one, and there's an evening one. And so we can cater to folks around the world. We've got 50 members on 5 continents, and almost no matter where you are, one of those 3 times would work. And the idea is you get together and you just start to talk about your practice. And it's very, very powerful because, most of us in the world are like little separate bubbles. We interact with people, but there's a limit to the depth. With these peer-to-peer groups, you get to know one another. And they're the kinds of people that you share your practice, you share your experiences with. And there's as I mentioned before, kind of a turbocharging that takes place where sometimes we use the term insight bootstrapping. So if I'm practicing by myself, I'm in a cave somewhere, I got to come up with all the insights myself. But if we have common vocabulary and we talk together, there's a chance that I can piggyback on your insights and you can piggyback on my insights, and I don't have to reinvent the wheel every time. So that's what the peer-to-peer groups are. And of course, those are once a week. We also have a forum, Still Point Forum. There's like a daily and almost like a real-time thing where people post practice notes, the kinds of things you might mention at a peer-to-peer group, right hot off the press, something happened. It's an opportunity to share that. People interact, they give you feedback, people describe similar experiences. We also have what we call a transformative media group, and we create our own content. And this was another thing we debated early on. There were a set of folks that said, no, we're not going to create content. There's so much content out there. The internet is awash with content and all these world-class teachers. What in the world are we going to do? And it turns out that there is, in fact, a very vital role for content creation in the Sangha. And the reason for that is that there's actually too much content out there. So what we do is we use it as a way of systematizing, organizing, and prioritizing the content. Otherwise, you're forced to just, you pick one teacher. Oh, I like so-and-so's podcast. Interesting. Well, that might be a good thing. It might be a good thing for a while, but it's limiting. And so we have recorded, we have well over 100, probably close now to a couple hundred hours of content. We have, in particular, once a week, we have something called a transformative media group. And we will take some podcast or some article or something that somebody read, or even just a question. Someone will come in with an inquiry, and we'll do an hour-long session. Get a bunch of people together on that topic. And the beauty of it is that, let's say you're a new member and you join the group and you have a particular interest. You can go to that library. It's pretty user-friendly. And you will find something on the Dharma is huge. So I'm not going to say every topic, but boy, I'll tell you, a particular tradition, a particular practice type, a particular teacher. And that'll allow you to do two things. One is you can listen to it and learn something from it. The other thing is you will get familiar with your Dharma mates, your other members of the Sangha. And so you'll know who the expert is on that. And you'll also learn the vocabulary, because groups learn vocabulary, and vocabulary in the Dharma world is really important. People use terms, they hear someone else use the same term, they assume someone means the same thing they do. A lot of times they don't. And so there's a lot of ships passing in the night that takes place in the Dharma. So it's turned out to be a very, very, very helpful mechanism.
Ron, I'm wondering if there's anything else you want to share with the listeners. Of course, we're going to have links to Dharmachanics on the episode page for this episode, but anything else you want to mention?
Well, yeah, here's a direction. Let me know if you want to go into this. Some predictions about the future. Right? That tends to engage audiences. And as you know, that can be kind of a fool's errand. You know what that great purveyor of Western crazy wisdom, Yogi Berra, said about predictions, right? But let's sort of forge ahead, because if you look at, and it's really I was going to say the future of the Sangha, but it's really more like a co-evolution, because the Dharma and the Sangha have really always co-evolved. Right? And if you go back to sort of Dharma 1.0 in Buddhism, it was the Buddha and some followers that he got, right after his enlightenment. He actually had his own experience in sanghas before he became enlightened. His first jhana teacher was a Hindu, and he learned the 8 jhana from Jain. So he already had some background in that. People started following around, so they depended on alms and generosity of broader communities. And then after a while, they ran into rainy season. They said, yeah, maybe we need to sort of settle down somewhere. So they depended on the dana, generosity of some landowners. And that's how the first Buddhist monasteries got set up. And that's sort of that structure of Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha really did not change all that much after that over the next 2,000 years. It did migrate, across the Silk Road, and it moved east. And of course, the practices moved east and west, and they ran into new cultures and new practices, and that's how the nine yanas of Buddhism evolved. But they were still, it's still that basic structure of how Sangha and Dharma work was largely unchanged. Okay, so now we fast forward 2,000 years. Now the Silk Road has become the internet, which is a whole lot quicker. And so we're talking about these virtual sanghas. So I'm going to be bold enough and maybe foolhardy enough to make some predictions about how the Dharma and the Sangha might co-evolve moving forward. The first thing that I'll say is that both the Dharma and the Sangha are likely to become more and more readily available. The internet is not going away; it's just getting bigger. More and more people are on it, and the reasons for Dharma and Sangha continue to grow. Right? We have a society that's in turmoil, and more people need some kind of a refuge, somewhere to go. And monasteries are not really an option for most people. Even retreats are getting to be more and more difficult. It's tougher and tougher for people to break away. So there's going to be more of these virtual sanghas. And I think you'll see them take on all kinds of structures. There may be other ones like Dharmachanics that are sort of flat, teacherless. All, as I mentioned, all teachers. No teachers means all teachers. You're probably going to see more teachers do things like this, and you know some people that are doing that kind of thing. Shinzen Young's doing things like that. You may even see some monasteries get more into this sort of world. So you take the local monastery and turn it into a virtual monastery and sort of take your monastery global. Another thing that you're going to see is more and more a part of these virtual sanghas will be virtual retreats. And we have done a number of these things. We've done a couple of 9-day retreats with Lee Brazington. These are, you'd think that it's tough to do a global retreat. Well, we have done these with people from California, Argentina, Ukraine, Australia, and folks, find a way to do these silent retreats. We're getting ready to do another with Gary Steinberg shortly. We're going to do more of these. The economics is very, very overwhelming because basically when you do a retreat, an on-location retreat, a week-long retreat, you're out $1,000 right out of the chute before you pay anything in dana to the teacher who's really delivering the value. Well, you do these virtual retreats, and you sleep in your own bed. You can do it with your friends because it's your sangha, and it's very, very compelling. So this is an example where not only you're not getting charged in virtual sangha, but you're getting $1,000 more of value. Another thing is that you are going to see communities within communities. Okay, so even within Dharmachanics, there's an artist group. We have a group that art is their practice, and our own John Simon who does a podcast, Drawing Your Own Path. He's written a book on it. A bunch of people get together and they do artist practice. We also have, for instance, a serious Vajrayana group, who's set of folks that are on a very sort of similar path. We've got a group that's kind of like a perennialist group who see the value in all these different traditions and see them reinforce one another. So, we have discussions about Buddhism, but we have discussions about other types of traditions too and the practices. And then one last thing that I'll say is that these sanghas will tend to become more open and more boundaryless. Okay, so for instance, now a lot of times we'll have these hangouts, and people will participate in other groups, and they may someone from an Advaita Vedanta group might join us for a particular practice. So that's my short list of predictions.
Thank you, Ron. And for those who are interested in finding out more, again, I'll be linking to Dharmachanics on the episode page for this episode. Our guest today, Ron Serrano. Ron, thanks for being here. Appreciate it.
Can I do one last thing?
Sure, of course. Go ahead.
I've got a quote to leave you and listeners with, and I do a lot of reading on sanghas. Thich Nhat Hanh, I think you know, is a big, proponent of sanghas, and he, in fact, has had this very controversial prediction that the next Buddha might be a sangha. And that's a whole topic we could talk about sometime.
Yeah.
Here's a quote from Thich Nhat Hanh that sort of sums things up for me. He says, if you have a sangha of 2, 3, maybe even 50 people who are practicing correctly, getting joy, peace, and happiness from the practice, then you are the luckiest person on earth.
Awesome. Thank you, Ron.
You bet, Ted. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to hear more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizen Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.